The Hobbit was one of my bedtime stories. Literally, it was read to me at bedtime, I read it myself at bedtime, I listened to a book on tape version at bedtime. It, along with the Chronicles of Narnia and my VHS of Dragon Slayer, all heavily contributed to my childhood fantasy landscape, the kind of make-believe worlds I'd play out in my backyard. The Lord of the Rings, on the other hand, alongside the Dragonlance novels and, my VHS of Dragon Slayer, contributed to my adult fantasy landscapes, the kind of make-believe worlds I'd play out in my Dungeons & Dragons group after school. Which really drives home the point that The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are really two very different things, despite being written by the same man and being part of the same continuity. But don't tell Peter Jackson that. He's going to take Tolkien's book of bedtime stories and film it exactly like he did the original film trilogy. Okay, before I get people mad, I liked the movie. Really, I did. But I didn't love it. It didn't grab me like the original trilogy did. It suffered from a bit of misdirection and a few poor decisions, and it altogether feels totally unnecessary. Maybe it's because this is the first time I've gone to a Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings film without a date. Maybe I'm just not getting laid enough and I'm being whiny. Now, I like Peter Jackson because he comes off as a director with enthusiasm. He goes into his productions being totally in love with what he's doing, be it his early gore comedies or his dramas or his sweeping fantasy epics. He clearly loves the source material that he's working with and bringing it to the screen. He has a passion for recreation and adaptation, and it doesn't hurt that he has the chops to pull this off most of the time. But he's also a director of excess. He's the guy who has to make everything big and loud and 10 times larger than it originally was. That was fine for the original trilogy, which was already about a war involving everyone ever. But here, Jackson will turn anything, even a passing line about giants throwing boulders in the distance, into this big, giant, epic thing about the characters trying not to get flattened by these giant earth elementals waging war among the mountain ranges. In that respect, Peter Jackson is like the good version of Michael Bay, and I mean that in the best possible way. But like Bay, unchecked, Jackson can make his films so cluttered and bloated that they can be hard to follow, and frankly, none of the action pieces here are up to the standard of the original trilogy. I suppose that's an issue of scope. In the original trilogy, each action scene was narrow in scope. Even in the big action pieces, we would typically focus on a set of known characters with their own unique looks and skill sets. There is a smaller number of participants, meaning a tighter focus and a heavier emphasis on choreography, as well as a larger investment in the individual characters. Sometimes we'd cut to cluttered battlescapes to remind the audience that there's a big war going on around these characters, but we'd just as quickly cut back to Legolas attacking a giant elephant or Aragorn and Gimli clearing a bridge of super orcs and return to that focus. That's not pulled off nearly as well here. There are a few very questionable decisions in how the action scenes in this film are shot. The biggest mistake in that respect was a scene near the end where the dwarves are trying to escape a goblin horde, and it's shot in such a way that it looks like a side-scrolling video game. We're so pulled back, and there's so many characters on the screen that I have no idea what's happening. But I don't think people tend to realize just how important establishing story and character is to action scenes. Now, in my discussions with other people about this film, there was a bit of an argument over claims that the film was overlong and bloated, and that the dozen dwarf characters are not given enough development and screen time. Some said that that was an oxymoron, and they were right. It was an oxymoron. And yet it still happened. Barely half of these characters get any kind of characterization beyond a stupid identifying gimmick, or worse, stupid identifying haircut. I will now try to name off all the dwarf characters off the top of my head without any reference. Alright. We've got Thorin the leader, Thorin's right-hand man, the old guy, the two dreamboat dwarves, the one with the ear horn, the bald one that shows up first, the fat one, the young one, the one with the hat, the starfish-haired one. I think that's 10. Let me think. It's gone. There are, like 3 dwarves I can't remember a single frame of. I can understand the problem. It's not like you could reduce the number of dwarves on screen without Tolkien fans breathing down your neck, but this leads to further problems in the production. That lack of distinction plays in these action scenes. The dwarves are almost always in a group. They never fight a singular opponent. That focus that made the action scenes in the original trilogy so engaging are lost. As much as Jackson tries to keep these scenes varied and unique, and they all have their own unique novelty, this source material just does not lend itself to a proper action film. First off, the dwarves themselves aren't all that dynamic in fights. They all pretty much have one setting, swinging something as hard as they can. Sure, sometimes they swing axes, sometimes they swing hammers, sometimes they swing giant swords. Every once in a while, one of the Dreamboat dwarves would pull out a bow, but for the most part, the dwarves had about as much range as a karate-chopping G.I. Joe action figure. Sure, Gimli did that, but that was the only dwarf in the original trilogy. He was the only one doing that. And most of these scenes have the same stuff happening. The dwarves come in, get defeated, Gandalf shows up and bails their asses. The Hobbit is an adventure story, but it never, ever lent itself to action. The other way in which the book was expanded for the film was Jackson tying in all these other materials outside of the book to tie the story into that of the Lord of the Rings more. I certainly find this more interesting than dialing up the action to 11, but it's also entirely stuff that takes away screen time from the dwarves that so badly need development, and time away from Bilbo Baggins, the titular Hobbit. They do give Bilbo Baggins a subplot about being accepted by the dwarves that, well, it's a touch cheesy, but it was completely necessary to give this film any semblance of an arc instead of a progression of set pieces that just end. It's my understanding that with these films completed, the Tolkien estate forbids anyone else from touching these books again, so I can understand Jackson wanting to get as much of this content up as he can, and again, I don't mind it so much, even if it gives us a bit of a tonal shift away from the cuter, sillier dwarf story. But you know what? Despite all of this, I still really enjoyed myself. Despite being 3 hours long, the film moved at a great pace. It was one of the quickest 3 hours I've had in a long time. The acting was pretty good. Martin Freeman plays Bilbo Baggins with the in-over-his-head deadpan he's pretty much famous for. Ian McKellen is still pretty much Gandalf incarnated, though he's visibly older and more tired. The same can't be said for his CGI counterpart, of course. Christopher Lee, Hugo Weaving, and Cate Blanchett reprised their roles from the original trilogy, but while they have good on-screen presence, they're pretty much just cameos. Probably the best new character, at least for me, was Radagast the Brown, a wizard of Gandalf's order that first learns of an evil force that might be tied to Sauron. Some might consider the character over the top, but I think he, out of everyone, captures the tone and spirit of the original book. I think he's a lot of fun, and I'm not just saying that because he's played by Sylvester McCoy, aka the Seventh Doctor. Seriously considering going as Radagast next Halloween, bird crap and all. To my surprise, I wasn't all that bothered by the CGI in this film. The original trilogy is pretty much famous for its use of miniatures, extensive makeup, on-location shooting, and detailed sets. They still have that to a degree in this film, but the CGI carries a lot more of the weight, but it didn't really stand out as badly as I thought it would, at least in the version I saw. Yes, I probably should address the elephant in the room, though I don't have a great deal to say about it. I saw this film in 24 frames per second in 2D, not in this 3D 48 frames per second thing. I can't honestly say how it affects the film, but people whose opinions I trust say that the format looked awful, that normal action was sped up in an unnatural way, and that it made the seams and the special effects all the more apparent. And frankly, I don't see the point in it all. 3D is an awful gimmick, and the few samples of 48 frame videos I've watched online don't impress. This is not a leap in technology like sound or color film was. At least those gave filmmakers new tools to work with. This just seems like needless complications. But again, I didn't see it in that format, so I can't properly judge it. This is the worst Lord of the Rings film, easily. But of course it's not bad. It's still fun. There's a lot of neat stuff for Tolkien fans. It's probably a fun film to see with the family. It could have been better, and it's clear that Jackson wants to recapture the magic of the original trilogy, even though The Hobbit, a bedtime story, is not that. It works in some areas, not as well in others, and it helps bring Peter Jackson's weakness as a filmmaker to light, but I certainly don't regret watching it, and I'd watch it again, preferably with a date. So, how does Thursday sound? There's a scene in this film where Alfred Hitchcock laments on how filmmaking used to be, that filmmakers used to experiment, take risks, and explore their art form, not like the stifling bureaucratic studio system of the late 1950s. Holy shit! I don't think I've ever felt more patronized by a film in my life, because Hitchcock is one of the most safe, traditional, pandering films I've seen in a long, long time. Honestly, that tiny little monologue and how not true it is to the film surrounding it would have dropped this film a letter grade if I actually did letter grades. You might as well have a scene where Hitchcock blasts Oscar bait films and think biopics are tedious. As I mentioned in my review of Lincoln, I do like it when biopics select a very specific point in a person's life, rather than trying to cover all or most of a historical figure's life. In this case, the film focuses entirely on Hitchcock during the production of his most famous film, Psycho, which Hitchcock had a lot of trouble with when dealing with the studios and the censors. And that's great, but beyond simply reenacting the events involved, there isn't a lot of substance here. The film is not all that interested in showing a modern audience exactly what it was that made Hitchcock a great filmmaker, or Psycho such a great film. It simply rides on the iconography of Psycho and Hitchcock's famous profile, pretending to be interesting when it's really not. Really, the focus is on Hitchcock's relationship with his wife Alma, played by Helen Mirren, who gives the best performance of the film. With just some minor editing, you could have rebranded the film Hitchcock and Alma, and made the film more about them and pushed Psycho into the background. It might have been better for it. But even then, what we have on screen is an old couple who have already jumped through the hoops of growing old together and have settled into a sexless routine. There's troubles when each other suspect each other of infidelity, there's bickering and forgiving, and I could write this in my sleep. There isn't a lot to speak of in the acting department. Not that it's bad, it's just a lot of people on autopilot. Anthony Hopkins looks nothing like Alfred Hitchcock, even under pounds of makeup, and while I can't say I object to his performance, you guys know that Hitchcock was kind of droll in real life, right? There was never a lot of energy to him, and you want to make him the center of the picture? Okay. Scarlett Johansson, Toni Collette, and James D'Arcy do their best impressions of various 1950s stars and starlets, and this film is so boring! It's so fucking boring! I guess there is one aspect that makes this film stand out. They gave Alfred Hitchcock an imaginary friend in Ed Gein, the real-life inspiration for Psycho, but I cannot honestly say what the point of these scenes were. They were spaced out too far apart, had little consistency with each other, and never seemed to be leading to any ultimate point. They just kinda stopped. The one new idea they had for this film, and it offers nothing. Absolutely nothing. You know what? I'm really starting to get tired of these golden days of cinema films. Films like Hitchcock, The Artist, My Week with Marilyn, Hugo, Me and Orson Welles, Liz and Dick, or to cite some older examples, Chaplin or RKO 281. I mean, don't get me wrong, some of those were good films, but it's like they're putting all the AFI Top 100 films on a dartboard at this point. We don't get enough films like Ed Wood, films that focus on the less well-known areas of filmmaking. Where's my biopic of the more controversial directors or films? The guys who are actually experimenting, taking risks, maybe risks that didn't pay off. If the world insists on giving us films about films, then they should be more willing to show us the other side of the coin. Or at the very least, don't make Hitchcock fucking boring and then lecture me on how fucking boring films are! God damn! Okay, I've been too negative about films people seem to like. Believe me, I don't do it on purpose. Let's switch things up with being positive about a film everyone seems to dislike. The Guilt Trip, a light comedy from The Proposal director Anne Fletcher, has been getting mixed to negative reviews thus far, and frankly, I went in with pretty low expectations. Maybe that was the key, but I found myself enjoying this film far more than I thought I would. It's not a must-see, but it's not an artificially calculated rom-com like Playing for Keeps. There's enough genuine emotion and charm hidden in it that you don't feel like you've wasted your time at the movies. Seth Rogen plays Andy, a chemist who invents a new organic cleaning product and is now going on a cross-country road trip to try and sell the product to a major company. While visiting his mother Joyce, played by Barbra Streisand, he learns a few things about her past that prompts him to bring her along, despite Joyce's over-possessiveness and oddball habits. It's a pretty typical setup for any number of comedy set pieces, but the film is actually kind of light in those. There are very few wacky misunderstandings and colorful characters. The focus is almost entirely on the son and mother dynamic. There are more shots of them talking in the car than anything else. That might sound boring, but it's honestly not. Seth Rogen and Barbra Streisand have great on-screen chemistry, and while they look nothing alike, I still bought their family relationship. Seth is pretty much playing the same kind of affable loser character he plays in the Judd Apatow movies, except with maybe a little less weed, but hey, that's the role he was born to play. Streisand is a ton of fun, not as annoying as the trailers depict her. Yeah, she occasionally toes the line of annoying Jewish mother stereotype, but she pulls it back just as quickly. Most importantly, these characters feel human, with realistic histories and complications. They're fleshed out and interesting. The movie is actually pretty atypical of its genre. There's no shoehorned love interest for either character, though maybes and could-have-beens pop up from time to time. The film is actually more about past loves and how we handle them after they leave, after we've moved on. Love's lost. It's something I can definitely relate to. Speaking of things I can relate to, the mother-son bond in the film was pretty realistic. In fact, it reminded me a lot of my relationship with my own mother, if not a complete one-to-one match. It's a good thing that this aspect of the film is so good, because the actual plot is kind of weak. The sales pitch stuff is very uninteresting, and while I kind of inferred why Rogen's character was so bad at it, I think it could have been clearer. The film does get a bit too slow in the middle. It begins to feel like we're not making as much progress as we should. There are also a few moments where things cross the line and get a bit too corny, but honestly, that's easier to overlook than you'd think. The final 10 minutes of the film are great, ending in a scene that might be a bit cliché, but Rogen and Streisand pull it off beautifully. I mean, it's not a gut-buster, it's not amazing, and it won't make my top 10 of the year, but it was definitely a pleasant surprise, and I love pleasant surprises. If The Hobbit is all sold out, this is probably your best plan B at the moment. See you next week.